So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. Today we'll have the concluding session of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. So we discussed some of the main themes which are germane to the purpose of this particular course, which is looking at how this novel may be seen as a meta text for the birth of imperialism, for the birth of the territorial, linguistic, cultural expansion that accompanied imperialism. Now, in the concluding section, we will look at the relationship that Crusoe establishes with a quote unquote savage cannibal that he rescues, a person that he decides to name Friday because it happens to be a Friday. Now, we talked about the politics of othering in the last class, how this connects very interestingly and very complexly with contemporary sentiments of xenophobia, the fear of the immigrant, the fear of the outsider, whereas very ironically, erasing the fact that the person fearing may have been an outsider at one point in time. So in this case, Robinson Crusoe's story, we have the same kind of a sentimental structure, where Crusoe comes in an island, takes over the island, essentially territorializes it, and yet he lives in this constant and permanent and a peril of being attacked by the outsider. Now, Man Friday in this novel happens to be someone, as I mentioned, he rescues and someone who gives a name and an identity as if he didn't have one identity before, and someone who turns into his own religion, someone who begins to speak his own language, albeit in a broken way. So again, we can see how the relationship that Crusoe has with Friday may be seen as a meta model of the relationship that the colonizer wanted to establish with the complicit colonized, a complicit subject in a colony. So in terms of how that particular subject will facilitate imperialism, will facilitate territorialization, etc. So the chapter Man Friday, which is chapter 14 in this particular version we are reading, it should be on your screen. It was one of the nights in the rainy season in March, the 24th year of my first setting foot in this island of solitariness. I was lying in my bed or hammock, awake, very well in health, had no pain, no distemper, no uneasiness of body, nor any uneasiness of mind, more than ordinary, but could by no means close my eyes, that is, so as to sleep. No, not a wink all night long, otherwise than as follows. And he goes on how to describe how he almost has a premonition of what is going to happen. And as he mentions in the paragraph after the one which we're skipping, my head was full for some time, taken up in considering the nature of these very wretched creatures. I mean, these savages, and how it came to pass in the world that the wise governor of all things should give up any of his creatures to such inhumanity, nay, to something so much below even brutality itself, as to devour his own kind. But as is ended in some at that time fruitless speculations, it occurred to me to inquire what part of the world these wretches lived in, how far off the coast was from whence they came, what they ventured over so far from home for, what kind of boats they had, and why I might not order myself and my business so that I might be able to go over thither as they were able to come to me. Now, we talked about how, very interestingly, we also see how these people that Crusoe very conveniently calls savages are able to build boards, they're able to pedal boards, they're able to make a canoe, are able to make a fire, and yet the Homo Faber version of their identity is very carefully put in the background. And what gets foregrounded again and again is the violence, the brutality, the quote-unquote uncivilized quality of these people, these subjects. Now, we'll move to the section where Crusoe essentially rescues Friday and how that whole thing comes into being. Okay, right. When this had agitated my thoughts for 2 hours or more with such violence that it set my very blood into a ferment, and my pulse beat as high as if I had been in a fever, merely with the extraordinary fervour of my mind about it. Nature, as if I had been fatigued and exhausted with the very thought of it, threw me into a sound sleep. One would have thought I should have dreamed of it, but I did not, nor of anything relating to it. But I dreamed that I was going out in the morning as usual from my castle. I saw upon the shore 2 canoes and 11 savages coming to land, and that they brought with them another savage. So again, look at the very homogeneous description. Everyone is a savage, everyone doesn't look like him or speak like him. or behave like him are very conveniently relegated or classified as savages and monsters, whom they are going to kill in order to eat him. So he seems to know everything what's going on in the mines. So the moment he sees this quote-unquote savages bringing another person, he automatically assumes and infers that they're going to kill and eat him. When all of a sudden the savage that they were going to kill jumped away and ran for his life. And I thought in my sleep that he came running into my little thick grove before my fortification to hide himself, and that I, seeing him alone and not perceiving that the others sought him that way, showed myself to him, and smiling upon him, encouraged him that he kneel down to me, seeming to pray me to assist him. So this is a classic God gaze that we talked about earlier as well, because with the binoculars, with the perspective glasses and a ladder that he mounted himself with, he's got a vision and a perspective to survey. They have this massive and almost complete surveillance of the whole island, right? And he continues in that direction in this description as well. So he appears to this person as a god, ready to redeem him, ready to protect him, and obviously protect him from the other savages that are chasing him down, presumably in Crusoe's assumption to kill him. So upon which I showed my ladder, made him go up, and carried him into my cave, and he became my servant. And that as soon as I had gotten this man, I said to myself, now I may certainly venture to the mainland, for this fellow will serve me as a pilot, and will tell me what to do, and whither to go for provisions, and whither not to go for fear of being devoured. So he's capturing, he's rescuing, and he's protecting this person, obviously with the motive to use the person to get more surveillance on the other side of the island, so that he can access more provisions, he can access more resources over there. What places to venture into, and what to escape. I waked with this thought, and was under the inexpressible impressions of joy at the prospect of my escape in my dream. There are disappointments which I felt upon coming to myself and finding it was no more than a dream were equally extravagant the other way, and threw me into a very dejection of spirit. So interestingly, how the reverie first appears before the action, right? So he has this reverie, this dream, as it were, where he's rescuing one savage from other savages, and is obviously using the person that is rescued to get more access and more direction in terms of what's happening on the other side of the island. Upon this, however, I made this conclusion, that my only way to go about an attempt for an escape was, if possible, to get a savage into my possession. And this is an interesting word, or possession. We talked about how the sense of ownership is very interesting and very important in Robinson Crusoe. He owns the island, he owns the animals, he owns the flocks and the and the birds and everything else. All the natural resources are owned by him in his island, and now he's about to own another human subject. So the word possession over here is not accidental. It's very much in keeping with the sentiment of the novel, where almost everything can be turned to a commodity. Now, we talked about how the subject is male and white over here, and what is not the subject is either the object, which can be made into a commodity, or the abject, which is the other savage, the other human subject, which is the abject compared to the the white male subject that Crusoe embodies. Right. So to get a savage into my possession, and if possible, it should be one of their prisoners. So look at the strategic thinking of Crusoe. If I manage to capture or manage to protect one of those savages' prisoners, I will get the loyalty for life, and with that loyalty, I can venture into other parts of the island and perhaps escape the island as well. Right. If possible, it should be one of the prisoners whom they had condemned to be eaten, and should bring hither to kill. But these thoughts still were attended with this difficulty, that it was impossible to effect this without attacking a whole caravan of them and killing them all. And this is not only a very desperate attempt and might miscarry, but on the other hand, I had greatly scrupled the lawfulness of it to me, and my heart trembled at the thoughts of shedding so much blood, though it was for my deliverance. I need not repeat the arguments which occurred to me against this, but they being the same mentioned before. But though I had other reasons to offer now, viz. That those men were enemies to my life, and would devour me if they could, that it was self-preservation in the highest degree, to deliver myself from this death or of a life, and was acting in my own defense as much as if they were actually assaulting me and the like. So you can see how he's building up an argument to justify the violence he's about to wreak him, he's about to perpetrate, sorry. So he's having this dilemma initially that, is it justified to shed so much blood, but he's managed to make a case in his own mind where he's saying that, well, I'm doing this to protect myself, so it is essentially an act of self-defense. So it's a very clever way to sort of make this argument, build a case to justify and legitimize violence. So saying that if I don't do this violence, if I don't commit this act of violence, my own life is in danger. Well, in reality, there's no immediate physical threat that Crusoe has, but he's making this anticipatory imagination, this anticipatory justification in order to carry out a raid. Right. So then he goes about how he makes the action plan. With these resolutions in my thoughts, I set myself upon the scout as often as possible, and indeed so often till I was heartily tired of it, for it was above a year and a half that I waited, and for a great part of the time went out to the west end and to the southwest corner of the island, almost every day, to seek for canoes, but none appeared. This was very discouraging and began to trouble me much, though I cannot say that it did in this case, as it had done some time before, that viz, wear off the edges of my desire to the thing. But the longer it seemed to be delayed, the more eager I was for it. In a word, I was not at first so careful to shun the sight of these savages and avoid being seen by them, as I was not eager to be upon them. So he's now making it more and more clear that he's very, very keen to attack them, to take over their possession and possess what they have. In other words, have a human slave. Besides, I fancied myself able to manage one, nay, 2 or 3 savages, if I had them, so as to make them entirely slaves to me. So again, this word is not accidental at all. He's looking for human slaves. He's looking for slaves to run errands for him, essentially carry on and perpetuate this sense of possession, the sense of property over here. So as you can see, Robinson Crusoe is also an interesting example of how intercultural property purchase takes place. So Crusoe, being a white male subject, goes to a non-white place and essentially makes almost everything around him into his property. And now he's extending that sense of property to other human subjects as well, which are defined first as abjects, subject, abject, and then the abject will be turned back into a commodity to serve Crusoe's utility. Right. It was a great while that I pleased myself with this affair, but nothing still presented. All my fancies and schemes came to nothing, for no savages came near me for a great while. So, and this entire time lag is important because he's getting more and more inclined to attack, more and more inclined to carry out this violence, and the moral dilemma seems to have almost disappeared. Now, we come to the section where he takes over the savage and he essentially attacks them with his gun. And this should be on your screen. I was surprised one morning early with seeing no less than 5 canoes all on shore together on my side the island, and the people who belonged to them all landed and out of my sight. The number of them broke all my measures, for seeing so many, and knowing that there always came 4 or 6 or sometimes more in a boat, I could not tell what to think of it, and how to take my measures to attack 20 or 30 men single-handed. So I still lay still in my castle. Again, look at the word castle over here. So he's essentially the monarch, and he's using this metaphors of monarchy to highlight or corroborate his sense of possession, his sense of property over here. So I lay still in my castle, perplexed and discomforted. However, I put myself into all the postures for an attack if anything had presented. Having waited a good while, listening to hear if they made any noise, at length, being very impatient, I set my guns at the foot of my ladder and clambered up to the top of the hill by my 2 stages as usual, standing so, however, that my head did not appear above the hill, so that they could not perceive me by any means. Here I observed, by the help of my perspective glass, that there were no less than 30 in number. So the perspective glass over here pretty much serves like a security footage, some kind of a CCTV camera that Crusoe has, an access, a visual access, surveillance. That they had a fire kindled, they had the meat dressed. How they had cooked it, I knew not, or what it was, but they were all dancing in I know not how many barbarous gestures and figures their own way round the fire. So the dance of these men are barbaric by default. The dance of these men are uncivilized by default. And that sense of the projection of otherness over here is something which we have constantly throughout this novel. So, so this is the point where Crusoe basically jumps and intervenes, and then begins to rescue one person that he names Friday subsequently. So there was between them, and this should be on the screen, there was between them and my castle the creek, which I mentioned often at the very first part of my story, where I had landed my cargoes out of the ship, and this I saw plainly he must necessarily swim over, or the poor wretch would be taken there. But when the savage escaping came thither, he made nothing of it, though the tide was then up, but plunging in, swam through in about 30 strokes or thereabouts, landed, and ran on with exceeding strength and swiftness. So the sense of excess is important over here, because the other is described through the vocabulary of excess. So the one person running away from the other persons is coming towards Crusoe, coming towards the creek between him and the other quote-unquote savages. When the three persons came to the creek, I found that two of them could swim, but a third could not, and that standing on the other side, he looked at the other, but went no further, and soon after went softly back, which, as it happened, was very well for him in the main. I observed that the two who swam were yet more than twice as long swimming over the creek as the fellow that had fled from them. It came now very warmly upon my thoughts, and did irresistibly, that now was my time to get me a servant again. So he's looking at it as an opportunity for him, as a strategy for him. This is my time, this is my moment to get a free servant, to get a slave for life, and perhaps a companion or assistant. So the word servant comes first, and then companion, and then assistant, and that's not an accident at all. And that I was called plainly by Providence to save this poor creature's life. Now, I had mentioned several times before how the biblical rhetoric, how the Christian vocabulary is used seamlessly in order to instrumentalize the sense of possession, the sense of expansion, the sense of territorialization, and in this sense, the sense of slavery. So it's actually used in a Christian vocabulary to say, this is a moment that God is showing me to get a slave, to get a servant, to get a free manservant for life. So what does it do? I immediately ran down the ladders with all possible expedition, fetched my two guns, for they were both but at the foot of the ladders, as observed before, and getting up again with the same haste to the top of the hill, I crossed towards the sea, and having a very short cut and all downhill, clapped myself in the way between the pursuers and the pursued, hallooing aloud to him that fled, who looking back was at first perhaps as much frightened at me as at them. But I beckoned with my hand to him to come back, and in the meantime I slowly advanced towards the two that followed. Then rushing at once upon the foremost, I knocked him down with the stock of my piece. I was loth to fire, because I would not have the rest here, though at that distance it would not have been easily heard, and being out of the sight of the smoke too, they would not have easily known what to make of it. Having knocked this fellow down, and the other who pursued with him stopped, as if he had been frightened, and I advanced a pace towards him. But as I came nearer, I perceived presently he had a bow and an arrow, and was fitting it to shoot at me. So I was then necessitated to shoot at him first, which I did, and killed him at the first shot. So he essentially kills one other person, and he knocks down the first person. So two people chasing the human subject, who becomes Friday later, are essentially knocked off. The poor savage who fled, but had stopped, though he saw both the enemies fallen and killed, as he thought, yet was so frighted with the fire and the noise of my piece that he stood stock still, and neither came forward nor went backward, though he seemed rather inclined to fly still than to come on. I hallooed again to him, and made signs to come forward, which he easily understood, and to come a little way, and then stopped again, and then a little further, and stopped again, and I could then perceive that he stood trembling, as if he had been taken prisoner, and had just been to be killed, as his two enemies were. I beckoned him again to come to me, and gave him all the signs of encouragement that I could think of, and he came nearer and nearer, kneeling down every 10 or 12 steps in token of acknowledgment for my saving his life. I smiled at him and looked pleasantly, and beckoned to him to come still nearer. So again, Crusoe's playing God over here. So he's smiling benevolently towards him, asking him to come nearer to him. This is becoming very much like a heavenly vocabulary, a very divine vocabulary. And Crusoe is obviously projecting himself very narcissistically as a, someone who enacted divine deliverance for this, unfortunate human subject. This, it seemed, was in token of swearing to be my slave forever. So he set my foot upon his head. So at length he came closer to me, and then he kneeled down again. And I would like to sort of highlight this section a little bit because it's a very symbolic motor movement happening over here, muscle movement happening over here. He comes, kneels down again, kissed the ground, and laid his head upon the ground. And taking me by my foot, set my foot upon his head. So this is the ultimate fantasy of the white subject over here, the white male subject over here. So he rescues the non-white subject, and the non-white subject comes and kisses the ground on his feet and takes the foot of the white man and places it on top of his head. So we can see how this very narcissistic fantasy is projected in this particular episode, and he gets a slave for life. And this, it seems, was in token of swearing to be my slave forever. So this Crusoe interprets very conveniently, I should add, that this must mean that he's desiring to be my slave forever. I took him up and made much of him and encouraged him all I could, but there was more work to do yet, for I perceived the savage whom I knocked down was not killed, but stunned with the blow, and began to come to himself. So I pointed to him, and showing him the savage that he was not dead. Upon this he spoke some words to me, and though I could not understand them, yet I thought they were pleasant to hear, for they were the first sound of a man's voice that I had heard, mine own excepted, for about 25 years. But there's no time for such reflections now. The savage who was knocked down recovered himself so far to sit upon the ground, and I perceived that my savage began to be afraid. But when I saw that, I presented my other piece at the man, as if I would shoot him. Upon this, my savage, for so I call him now, my savage. So again, look at the transfer of epithets over here, transfer of the language, the switch, the possessive over here, my savage. So, the sense of ownership, the sense of property is clearly established. So upon this, my savage, for so I call him now, made a motion to me to lend him my sword, which hung naked in a belt by my side. So I did. He no sooner had it, but he runs to his enemy, and at one blow cut off his head as cleverly. No executioner in Germany could have done it sooner or better, which I thought very strange for one who had reasons to believe never saw a sword in his life, except their own wooden swords. So again, Crusoe is very surprised to see that Friday, the person that he's rescuing over here, can use a sword and kill someone with one blow, and is comparing him with the clinicality of the German executioner. So again, this is from a British position. This means something very culturally significant, as you can imagine. And he's also assuming that this is a man, the human subject over here, has never seen a sword before, a metal sword before, except for a wooden sword. So he was very impressed with his motor skill and motor movement. Right. So, however, it seems, as I learned afterwards, they make their wooden swords so sharp, so heavy, and the wood is so hard that they will cut off heads even with them. And arms, and that at one blow too. When he had done this, he comes laughing to me in sign of triumph, and brought me the sword again, and with abundance of gestures, which I did not understand, laid it down with the head of the savage that he had just killed just before me. So he, cut off the head of the savage and presented the head to Crusoe, while also laying down his sword. But that which astonished him most was to know how I'd killed the other Indian so far off. So pointing to him, he made signs to me to let him go to him. So I bade him go, as well as I could. When it came to him, he stood like one amazed. So again, he's looking at the effect of the gunshot, so to speak. Looking at him, turned him first on one side, then on the other, looked at the wound that the bullet had made, which it seems was just in his breast, where it had made a hole, and no great quantity of blood had followed, but had bled inwardly, for he was quite dead. He took upon his bow and arrow and came back. So I turned to go away and beckoned him to follow me, making signs to him that more might come after them. So, this is a point in the story where Crusoe establishes his mastery, his identity as a master, because he has a slave over here. Now, what's interesting for us to know is how the master-slave relationship, or the binary over here, is one which is interdependent. I mean, Crusoe is a master because he's a slave, and Friday is a slave because Crusoe is a master. So it works in that interdependent way. And again, this may be seen as some kind of a meta model of how imperialism and colonialism took place. Okay. So we'll come to the end now, and the description of Friday over here is interesting. He was a comely, handsome fellow, perfectly well made, with straight, strong limbs, not too large, tall, and well shaped, and as I reckon, about 26 years of age. So again, this is entirely something that Crusoe is interpreting, and obviously whatever is interpreting or inferring, he's presenting in such a way as if it's information. So interpretation, which is quite subjective in quality, is masquerading as information. Again, this is very, very common in terms of the colonial process of knowledge production, where the colonizer's subject position is essentially legitimized to the extent that that becomes the objective position. So the subjectivity of the position is carefully concealed, shall we say, and whatever comes from that position is by default seen as the objective empirical position. So this also has a lot to do with how the politics of knowledge production and knowledge consumption takes place during colonialism. He had a very good countenance, not a fierce and surly aspect, but it seemed to have something very manly in his face. And yet he had all the sweetness and softness of an European in his countenance too, especially when he smiled. So the sweetness and softness obviously conferred to the Europeans. So there is something sweet and soft and pleasant about him, which is comparable to the Europeans. The European here becomes a benchmark of civilized sweetness, civilized softness. His hair was long and black, not curled like wool. His forehead was very high and large, and a great vivacity and sparkling sharpness in his eyes. The color of his skin was not quite black, but very tawny, as the Brazilians and Virginians and other natives of America are, but of a bright kind of a dun olive color, and there had in it something very agreeable, though not very easy to describe. His face was round and plump, his nose small, not flat like the Negroes, a very good mouth, thin lips, and his fine teeth well set and white as ivory. So we can see how the description of this person is also quite objectifying. It's also quite commodifying. And obviously Crusoe uses a word which is offensive today. But then we have to situate this text in the particular context of his times, where this was an acceptable word and wasn't seen as offensive, because it was obviously a way to address the other. But the nose, the lips, the countenance, the anatomical features are all amplified. And we talked about amplification in the previous class as well. How the white man's gaze over here, the white man's perspective over here, is essentially an amplifying gaze. So we'll stop here and we'll wind up. But what I will do in a way of winding up this text, winding up the story Robinson Crusoe, is basically give you a sense of what this novel is doing and how it is important for us in the context of this particular course. Because as you can understand, you can see in the course of the story, he's called Friday because he's given the name Friday, because Crusoe had essentially rescued him on a Friday. So the randomness of naming here is also part of the empirical enterprise of knowledge production and knowledge classification that is entirely coming from the subject position of the colonizer, the imperial man. But it is also important for us to understand how Friday's identity essentially becomes erased and then reproduced, because we don't quite know what he was in terms of his religion before Crusoe came to the island. He's just given Christianity, he's given Christian faith, he's given the Christian vocabulary and value system, and the whole thing becomes some kind of an imposition, some kind of a name giving. And this name giving thing is very, very important, because the entire knowledge production and consolidation and projection takes place from the perspective of the white man. So the white human subject here becomes the consolidating, galvanizing position of knowledge. And what we see throughout the novel is how almost everything is commodified, almost everything has a price tag, almost everything has a value to it. And that valuation, the whole politics of pricing something, the whole politics of commodifying something, is done from the position of the colonized, from the position of the white male subject. And I use the word white male very carefully because the female is conspicuously absent in Robinson Crusoe. In fact, Those of you who read the whole novel would know that Crusoe very briefly mentions his wife towards the end of the novel, so as to speak, that his wife appears in a novel, produces more sons for him, and disappears by dying conveniently, by dying quickly. So the whole purpose of the woman here is to produce more men who will carry on the legacy of Crusoe. And again, we need to situate this in the structure of imperialism around that time, where the white man goes, creates a legacy through expansionist, territorializing policies, of military policies, taking over islands, giving it a new name, giving it a new epistemic structure, a new knowledge structure, in the form of language and religion and classification and naming and so on and so forth. And the entire thing is done very interestingly in this particular novel, with a constant reference to Christianity, a constant reference to the religion. And in many occasions, you find the religion over here is also a means to justify violence, also a means to justify certain kind of acts which would otherwise be seen as, very inhuman, almost brutal in quality. So it's a very complex cultural condition, and that's exactly what we're looking at here, and how this is also a novel which is reflective of social changes, how the merchant class is rising in terms of its acquiring of wealth, in terms of its expansionist enterprise. And there's a sense of a democratization about it. The common man can become a sailor and go on and make a lot of money and wealth and make a name for himself. But at the same time, it's also a time of new cartographic expansion, map making. And with the map making, the whole idea of trade, territory, and property comes into being, right? How everything becomes a property, including human subjects. And the production of property over here operates in all kinds of ways, through symbols, through language, through religion, through human subjects, obviously through animals and other kinds of non-living entities as well, right? So this is the context of Robinson Crusoe. This is the way in which this novel should be studied, particularly in a course like this, in terms of how it is reflective of social changes, profound and complex social changes. And we'll look at, in the subsequent classes, we'll look at how we can situate this novel, this piece of fiction that Daniel Defoe does. It's a really interesting novel because it appeals to human imagination even today. And as I mentioned, that there are many instances, many themes in Robinson Crusoe, including xenophobia, including the fear of the outsider, including the fear of the immigrant coming and taking over your land, your territory, your culture, that are very, very pertinent even today in the current geopolitical climate that we internalize and inhabit. So we stop at this point. This is officially the end of the novel in terms of how you're reading it. Of course, it's a much bigger novel. It does many other things. But for the purpose of this course, we are culling out certain sections and looking at how those sections may be studied in some close details in order to see how the novel is reflective of the social and cultural changes that are happening around that time. But in the subsequent classes, we'll look at the secondary scholarship on Robinson Crusoe to see how that notion of change, social change, are happening in terms of trade, in terms of commerce, in terms of territorialization, and how this novel may be seen in 2024 as interestingly reflective of those diachronic changes, the social structural changes. So these are things which will continue in the subsequent classes. Thank you for your attention.